Okay, so good morning everybody that's listening so far. Hello and welcome to the ISO 45001 Are You Ready webinar, brought to you by Effective Software. So I'm Darragh Gagan, CEO here at Effective. We have Kevin manning the webinar, so he'll be looking after our incoming questions, and today I'm lucky to be talking to Chris Ward. So Chris has worked in health and safety for the best part of 40 years. He's a key member of the BSI committee, responsible for OHSAS 18001 and 45001. Chris is also the owner of the ISO OHSAS 45001 LinkedIn group, which currently is standing at about 3,500 members, so there's lots of interest out there. So Chris is well placed, I think, for today's discussion. Thank you for joining us, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Darragh. Yes, that was the LinkedIn group has grown very, very quickly, and it's growing quicker than ever before now that we got to this stage of the standard development.
No, it's great to see, and obviously it's a key topic within the industry. So look, we're delighted to be talking to yourself, and I'm delighted to be going through this today. So look, for all those listening, as you all probably know, some may not, but the ballot to publish 45001 has been successful. So Chris, right now we don't have a publication date, is that right? But possibly early 2018, is that the kind of indications that we have so far?
Yes, indeed. I think most people are guesstimating that date. Technically, it could squeeze in at the end of this year, 2017. But there's a key meeting of the drafting committee in Malaysia, 18th to 23rd of September, when they make the decision as to what happens next. Their biggest issue is that they've got, although the draft has been approved for publication, they've got to process 1,300 comments. And a lot of these comments are what they call technical comments, and technical comments normally require another draft standard, normally known as the final draft standard. And if that goes ahead, probably later this year, that puts the publication date back a little. If they choose not to go for a final draft standard, the publication date can come forward somewhat, but highly unlikely to be this year, more likely to be early next year. And just as a matter of interest is, when the standard's published, it will be published in English, French and Russian, plus whatever the national standards bodies do.
Okay, no, great. So yeah, so I suppose maybe we'll probably have a bit more clarity in around that on the 18th to the 23rd of September. So following that, we all should probably have a bit of a better insight into maybe the next steps, the official next steps and dates. So we'll probably all be listening intently for that and seeing what happens at that stage. So okay, look, for the purpose of today's listeners, what we have planned, I suppose we will hopefully anyway be an informative Q&A with Chris. We're going to run through some of the burning questions on what happens next and what does it all mean. I think we have, is it 700 or 800? How many people have we got? 800. So we have 800 participants, I think, registered for today's webinar. So it might get very busy. Poor Kevin is over in the corner taking in all the questions. Anyone who wants to submit a question, feel free to use the facility in the control panel to do that. So he's going to try and filter those questions through. And we're going to try and work through as many as we can. So we're going to go through a kind of an initial Q&A with Chris. And then we are going to kind of take as many of those questions as we can and kind of group them into buckets. Well, Chris has kindly agreed to address probably the majority of those questions. Again, we'll organize them into sections and sort of relevant topics. Chris is going to answer those topics and give us some feedback on that. And following on from this, then we're going to publish those through onto Chris's LinkedIn forum, and we'll also be sending that out via email to everybody that's on today's webinar as well, so all the people that are registered. Just one other thing to point out before we jump into the sort of quick fire questions is that there is a handout section there as well on your control panel, and on that handout there's an ISO 45001 white paper available, so anyone that wants to download that, that's something that was prepared in conjunction with our marketing team and some industry experts, so that's there and available to download if you guys find that useful. So, Chris, if that's okay, we'll just jump straight in maybe and start in on some of the questions.
Okay, yes, Darragh.
So, I suppose just to start off, Chris, the ballot, obviously it was voted in favour of publishing the standard. I know we touched off some of this really, but what are the steps now leading to the publication? So following on from that, following the approval, what are the steps, I suppose, now to get us to a new standard out in the industry?
Yeah, yes, I mentioned earlier that there will be the meeting in Malaysia, and if the final draft standard is published, that will incorporate the comments that were made at the balloting stage last month. The committee will then consider and vote on that draft. And then decide a publication date with any revised material. But what is certain, Dara, is that it will be a published standard. The committee cannot now vote against publishing it, so it'll be published in some form or other.
And that was the question I was going to ask. So when you say they have to consider those comments now and vote on the standard, it's not a case of now we can roll back. It's a case of, okay, the vote will be on any revisions, any of the additional comments or any sort of amendments or changes, but it will be moving forward. That's correct?
That's correct, yeah. And from my own knowledge of having looked and heard of the comments, they become, whilst they're important to some national standards bodies, to the world at large, they will seem quite marginal.
Okay.
That's okay. Not to diminish the importance of the drafting committee's work.
No, of course.
Because they need to reach a consensus, really. That is it, essentially it. Yeah, okay. Darren.
Yeah, no, that's great. So I suppose the key clauses then, as we look at the standard, really, there's a couple of key clauses. We talk about context, leadership, worker participation, documented information, as opposed to, I think, formally documents in terms of the terminology, risk and opportunities, and continuous improvement. So could you give us a brief synopsis maybe on each one of those and just kind of relate the key elements of those for the listeners, please?
Yes, Darren, I've got to bear in mind I've got a wide range of knowledge of and experience of the attendees here. So there's a little bit of basic definition that I'll just quickly run through. And bear in mind, when I give you a definition of these clauses, put in front of it, prefix each one as proportionate. Proportionate to the size and the complexity of the organization. So we've got large multinational global companies plus small and medium-sized companies, and may even be micro organizations. So proportionality is the word here. Context means that the organization, that's the business, has to understand its internal and external factors that are relevant to what the business does. I'll come on to further detail later on that one. Okay. Leadership is the top management. The top management is a controlling mind of the organization, people at the very top. And they've got to demonstrate leadership commitment. Worker participation, that's very important because, first of all, you've got to understand who the workers are. And virtually everyone is a worker. Even the top managers and top management are workers too, but they're called managerial grade workers. And they include anybody who works for the purposes or activities of the organization. Documented information, this, when we come on to explaining it, is a key thing about making this standard accessible. And it's documented information, not documents, not records, but documented information. I'll explain more later. Risk and opportunities, this is something new to those who will be used to the 18001 standard, and the risk has changed somewhat in terms of traditional knowledge about risk. Here the risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives, but nevertheless subsumed by that is risk in relation to occupational health risk, and that is, as it was before, it's a question of risk, which is likelihood and severity computation. Opportunities, the opportunity is that for improvement of risk management and the risks managed down to level, which is also risk to the management system itself. More of that later. And it's all in relation, this risk and opportunity is all in relation to the context of the organization, the interested parties, and the management system itself. And we've got continual improvement, which is to improve the performance of the system, normally done by improving participation, improving communication, and then this needs to be documented. I think there we are, Darrett. That's a quick overview.
Okay, so maybe we jump into each one of those, I suppose, in a little more detail. So we talk about context, so the organisation to understand internal and external issues. So how important is that? I mean, I'm assuming obviously that's very relevant with the contextual basis of any assessment and certification.
Yes. Well, context is very important, and a lot of people new to our safety management systems will not perhaps understand what context is. When I worked for HSE, I explained it in the HSG 65 guidance as a risk profiling, and I think that's perhaps how people need to look at it. It's the risk profile of the organisation in the broadest sense of the word, not just health and safety risk, but it's the risk to the business and how these are managed and controlled. So you may get risks to the business from outside influences. So the context has to take into account what the regulatory regime may be, what the legal requirements are, what social expectations may be, and what the interests of their internal interested parties are, and those can be their workers and customers and clients. And so there needs to be an assessment of all those influences on the business. And in the assessment, one should reach a conclusion as to what is going to be important, what are the priorities, and what needs to be done about it.
So Chris, even if you're talking about external influences and things like that, and the external even legislation frameworks as you mentioned, would that even be down to things like, say, for companies in the UK looking at Brexit and how that may affect the legislation framework may change? Because of that, are those the external kind of forces that you'd be talking about?
Certainly the regulatory regime, and also if we talk about trading, which is essentially what Brexit's about, the trading partners that you have, the supply chain and your customers, they all are interested parties and have an influence on what's happened, what happens within the organisation, and in some cases it can be quite a significant effect, because some clients or customers that they will want to impregnate the company with. So one has to take those into account. I think that's a reasonable example. So you've got the statutory ones, you've got the supply chain issues, and then in different countries now there's much more emphasis given to kosher and governance. Some is statutory, some is voluntary, but the more sophisticated organisations, those likely to go for 45,001, will be very concerned and interested and find corporate social responsibility a significant priority.
Okay, very good. So if we look on to the next sort of one that we talked about, which is leadership, and I suppose there's if we read that, and if I was reading that, I'd be looking to go, well, are they talking about the EHSQ leadership? Are they talking about company leadership? Is that defined purely in terms of top level management, or is it when we reference leadership, what are the key things we're looking at there within that?
Yes, well, it's a bit the workers, seniors. Well, their leadership within the standard is
sorry, Chris. Sorry, Chris. The connection, I think, just stalled for a little second. So if we maybe just go back to the start of that, that would really be appreciated.
I'm starting again. Okay, so leadership in terms of the standard is related to top management and what they need to do. However, within the standard, you can argue that everyone is a leader, even down to the team leader and the individuals. But leadership in terms of top management is that they need to show commitment. And so it's all within the organisation, including the health and safety practitioner. But the top management have got to show their commitment through normal ways in which good leadership is shown: visibility. They've got to be sincere and consistent. No reprisals. This is actually written into the standard. No reprisals for people who report poor safety performance or the absence of some safety equipment. And then the leaders have got to align what they do with their business objectives. And I mentioned sincerity. This is all about not paying lip service to health and safety, but to actually show a level of commitment to it. However, the top management have got to remain accountable, although a lot of what they do in terms of their business function can be delegated and other people made responsible. And this is where I look back to everybody can be a leader. And in a good dispersed health and safety management system within an organisation, everyone is expected to show good health and safety performance, so they become individual leaders to their peers.
Okay, very good.
Hey, Dara.
And that probably leads on to the, suppose, you know, when you're talking about the peers and worker participation. So let's jump into that one a little bit. And why is there so much emphasis, I guess, given to worker participation in this standard?
Well, I think most people, and certainly safety practitioners, will recognise if you want to know how the job is done and how it's done, whether it's done safely or not, you speak to the person doing the job, and this is at all levels. But if you're in a production facility, those on the production line will know how difficult or easy it may be, and it's normally easier if it's safer, and it's normally if it's difficult, it's likely to be unsafe. So they have the solutions. They also know the workarounds. So top management may well be setting standards and procedures and policies, but then the workers are working around that to make the job happen. So you've got to stop and press down on that. And the way it is done successfully is to get all people involved in making informed decisions about what should be done. And it's not about so much about providing information or top-down communication. It's about joint decision making, and not everybody needs to be involved in making those joint decisions. You can have worker representatives, of course, trade union representatives, but there should be some process in which all are involved. And again, I mentioned proportionality. You'll have the large organisation with workers representatives. If you come down to perhaps a small construction company, that involvement can be nothing more sophisticated than toolbox talk, where those involved get a fair say in what happens next.
And I suppose, yeah, I mean, if we look at that, I presume as part of the standard, they're going to be looking to have that, you know, some documented proof around that participation. And I guess really it's to step away from the, you know, top management and people writing I suppose the processes and the documentation within the companies to just, like you said, paying lip service. It's more about really getting underneath the operations of the company. Is that fair to say? And making sure that those operations are included relevantly within the standard and documentation. Is that fair?
Sure. I think to make a virtuous circle here, you'd have the top management setting out the procedures, processes, doing all the training and providing the resources. But then that top leader or leadership should go out to the workers at all levels and ask a simple question. Is your job difficult to do? And therefore it makes you feel either uncomfortable or unsafe. That's the acid test, isn't it? And if you've got an open, if the workers feel they can trust their manager or management, they will tell them. If they don't trust, things will still be hidden. So this is not a simple thing to be effective in getting good worker involvement. Far from it, because this is where the context and the different cultures and different and people listening from around the world here, they will recognise that in their cultures, this worker engagement is very, very difficult.
I think, like, I think you hit the nail on the head. Engagement, no matter what, you know, what part of safety we're involved in, whether it's the operational side all the way through to the certification, engagement is absolutely critical. Absolutely. So, okay, in terms of so with reference to the risk and opportunity clause, and there's lots of questions coming in, so we'll get onto those fairly soon, Chris. There's a lot of questions coming through here, but just in terms of the reference to risk and opportunity, you know, how are they going to be looked at in more detail? Is that, you know, obviously very company specific stuff? Is there particular types of risks? And obviously you mentioned I suppose the effect of uncertainty and obviously the standard OHS risks. Kind of, if we can get under the skin of that a little bit in terms of the risk and opportunity and what they're looking to try and get done there within that.
Yeah, yes, we're talking here, of course, risk not only to health and safety, but also to the management system. And here it's a follow-on from risk profiling, and you've got to take into account what your particular risks are in your particular organisation. And so you look at the various sectors. So in some sectors it's a high risk sector, oil and gas, for instance, and there will be certain priorities. And also within that sector, perhaps oil and gas, they will have their own specific standards, maybe even specific legal requirements. And they need to be taken into account. You know, the other part of it is customer requirements may drive a risk, because if you're not going to meet customer requirements, you may not get that customer sustaining their relationship with you. So you've got to have a look at that. And then the risk to the management system. Well, a lot of people scratch their heads on this one and think, well, what is this about? Well, I describe it as, well, it's if you've not got the capacity to run the system properly, in other words, you don't have trained people, trained in health and safety where necessary, or competent, or committed, or you don't have the right sort of knowledge, that would be a risk to the management system. And then the culture of the organisation puts a risk on the management system, because it may become a production-orientated organisation where health and safety is takes second place, and it is not equal in terms of importance to production. So if there's a breakdown and people want more production because of the result of the breakdown, quite often, Dara, what happens is there are shortcuts in terms of health and safety. So that itself would be a risk not only to health and safety, but a risk to the management system.
So, Chris, it's quite broad, really. What we're looking at is we're looking at business risk, operational risk, resourcing, learning, behaviour. We're talking about a very wide spectrum of assessment in terms of inclusion in the standard. Is that clear? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, indeed. And this is all fairly new stuff, really. The previous standard, that's 18,001, didn't go into this sort of detail, didn't address risk in this sort of way.
So is it fair to say that this will include a lot more people, I suppose, maybe at the planning and strategy stage within an organisation, rather than just the EHS sort of functions?
Yes. Well, I think this is all about dispersing management of health and safety across the organisation, but also making top management in all the business functions accountable for what they do. So I've mentioned production, there's finance, there's human resources. They all now should be involved in understanding these risks and opportunities and how their parts of the business can jeopardise the management system and besides the risk. Okay, Darren?
No, that's very interesting, and I think it sounds like it's kind of a structure to put risk and, I suppose, safety management at the core of everything a business does, which is obviously how things get done best, which is hopefully a good thing. Okay, in terms
of...
Sorry, go good?
Yeah, I was going to say, my colleague, Business Associate Jane Standerwick, she audits significant and she think about OHS risks and she said the connect between the business objectives and health and safety now is much more pronounced, and this is going to be a forerunner of what will happen with 45,001.
Yeah, no, great. I think that's a good thing, you know. So the last point, I suppose, just in terms of the key sort of clauses that we look at, one of them then is the documented information. So that's a shift from, I suppose, documents to documented information. Let's talk about what kind of relevance that has, and I suppose obviously in a changing landscape between digital and different ways of tracking things, and obviously software systems and management systems. I presume that's probably a key part of this.
But it's a key change. It is also, the standards makers were quite perceptive when they set down this route a few years ago, but with the increasing amount of digitalization and difference, the 45001 is geared up to make use of that, probably make use of it much more than standards makers really thought. But so you don't need to have the same approach to documents and having a procedures manual stuck on a shelf in a cupboard in the safety advisor's office. It's now that documented information can be in any form, audio, visual, taken on handheld devices, and you can see possibilities of, okay, the CEO sitting in an office in one country sends a message halfway around the world saying to their operator to take a photograph of what you're doing now, and the operators can take a photograph of what they're doing now and make a health and safety judgment instantaneously. This is going to be very powerful, particularly for smaller organizations. So it touches on what I mentioned earlier, and that's going to be dispersed ownership of health and safety. So it's not now just the domain of the safety advisor sitting over at head office. So it really is a game changer, Darren.
I think that's very powerful, Chris. I think obviously, you know, there is that safety mantra, and we've touched on it on a few points. It's you know, safety is not my responsibility; it's everyone's responsibility. That is true. I think that's core within what we're trying to achieve within the standard. But I think in what you're mentioning in terms of the, I suppose, technology and the power that's there, at least now it's recognised in the standard. So I know there was often concerns about, well, look, if it wasn't documented within the SOPs or the process manual or whatever we had, that there was a concern there. And the fact that we're recognising that within the new standard and I suppose opening up the world to I suppose technology and what it can bring, then that's a good thing. Obviously, we'd say that as a software provider, but I think that's a key benefit across all the spectrums, not just software. So that's really good. Okay, a couple of the questions coming in, and I suppose are relevant to the sort of the other management standards. So when we look at how does the standard fit into other integrated management systems, so your 9001, 14001, and others, you know, can you give us a bit of background into that and how it fits in?
Yeah, all these standards that you mentioned there work to a common high-level structure, and it's described as Annex SL. So the key clauses in each of those standards have a common title. There's an awful lot of common text, and then this specific text in relation to whether it's environment or health and safety. And bearing in mind that there's over 1 million registered, certified, I think, to 9001, about 300 to 14,001, and there's an awful lot of organizations already working to this high-level standard. So 45,001 should be a fairly easy step for them. And the pitfall about the high-level structure is that it is quite generic. The difficulty will come, particularly for 45,001, because it's health and safety orientated, when you try to understand how it can be specifically applied to organizations' health and safety approach, because there's some jargon that health and safety professionals use and understand it, but high levels don't quite understand it. Risk is particularly one example. So all these standards, particularly 45,001, will need specificity so that people can understand. And just as an aside, the British standards are proposing to produce draft guidance as standard, but ISO will not have guidance. So ISO is not producing its own guidance. BS is proposing to do so, and we're just looking at some drafting of that already. So I think there's a big future for 45,001, and whilst you've got about 100,000 verified to 18,001, that number will increase significantly when 45 comes in.
Okay.
Thank you, Darren.
Okay. Thank you. So again, a sort of a common question that's coming through here, I suppose the key differences between 18,001 and 45,001, that seems to be a very, very common question, and one I'm sure is on everyone's mind. And maybe just that then, as we're answering that, if we can kind of think about giving us some feedback in relation to those that have already attained 18,001, what's the gap there to 45,001? Is there, is there a transfer, a standard enough transfer process? Is there a big gap between the two? Obviously there's differences, so maybe if we look at that, the key differences, and I suppose the steps the companies need to look at to maybe transfer that over.
Yes, they you're looking at sort of a gap table, really. I've got a gap table on my website, people may well want to look in a bit more detail later. However, I've touched on the key differences. They were in relation to context, leadership and risk opportunities. A lot of those were what is new in 45,001. The area as well, and that's the management of change in 45,001, which 18,000 didn't have. So you've got to prepare before the change happens, so that you've done your risk assessments and control the risks before you introduce them. There will be, this has been declared that when 45 is published, 18,001 will be withdrawn virtually on the day of publication. But BS are giving a 3-year period, a window in which those already working to 18,000 can continue to work to 18,000, can continue to be certified. But because these are different standards making bodies, ISO is a completely different standards. So it's called migration or transition, but in actual fact you're applying for a different standard. But the approach of BS certainly is that it will take into account, if they're certifying to 45, they will take into account performance of 18,000. But good performance to 18,000 is not going to get you 45 for the reasons I've just mentioned. There is a significant differences. It's a good starting point. Some people are asking, well, how long shall I carry on with 18,000? Or shall I apply for 18,001? I think the perceived wisdom is, if you want to apply for a standard now, the only one you can really apply for is 18,000. So you might as well start there, and then sometime next year when 45 is, you can then start looking to moving to that. And by the way, once the standard is published, it normally is a minimum of 6 months before you can become certified to 45, or to any new standard, but that will be the case in 45.
So because these were common questions as well, so if we look at that from publication date, we're going to have a 3-year transition period is what we're talking about, and we're probably talking about in terms of new applications for 45,001, like you said, it's going to be probably mid next year after, all going well with publication at the start of next year. You'd be talking mid, so, whether it's summer, whether it's autumn, I suppose, depending on when it happens, but they're the kind of indicative timelines that we have right now. Okay. Very good. Very good.
Sure.
So one of the things, so following on, I suppose, just conformity to the standard, whether it's verified or certified. So self-certification is now something obviously possible within 45,001. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, what you think that means for organisations, and I suppose the various routes now that there are to that to the achievement of the standard.
Yes. Okay. So the standard can be achieved in a few different ways. There's a formal ways are you either go for a type 1 self-verification, or second party audit, or a third party audit with or without certification. Or you can work to the standard and be quite happy to do so. And if you don't feel responsible for any outside interested parties, well, good on you for working to it. But you don't have to have any verification or any audit to work to it. But the type 1 self-verification, I think, is going to be quite a significant game changer again. Here, if the organisation works to the standard, undertakes the audits and all the requirements, the performance that's required in the system, it can self-declare that it works to a standard, the 45,001 standard. And those people doing business with it can either take it at face value or not. And that might lead on to the second stage, which is a second party audit, and that's where an external supply chain, quite often, supply chain organization will come and audit the company, or any other external audit can audit. And then you have second party verification. And then the third party, which I'm sure most people are familiar with, they can either have it certified by an accredited organization or non-certified by a qualified certified organization without accreditation. So that was right. That came across okay, I think. Yeah, it's a certification with or without it, but the third-party audit has got to be by a qualified auditor who is normally accredited, but may not certify the organisation if they don't want to pay that extra money. And that's one of the things involved with these standards, Dara. They're very expensive to get certification, but if you go for self-verification, you probably get a good deal.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, it has the opportunity there really where companies can demonstrate that, show that, and continue to work to those standards. Whether, like you said, it's audited or signed off or not. I mean, it has the potential there really to change how people manage that, which is fantastic. Yeah. Okay. A couple of other questions coming through, Chris. Worker participation, does that include regular subcontractors? And in a particular case, in your opinion, would that kind of have a major impact around the construction sector?
Yeah, well, indeed. So go back to the definition. Workers includes everybody, including outside organisations, contractors, and so on, if they're working on the activities of the organisation. So participation is necessary, and it has to be involvement. And bearing in mind, it has got to be joint decision making. That's quite it's quite a challenge, particularly the construction sector. Because normally those are near the bottom of the food chain don't normally get a say, do they? But I think, having said that, construction in the UK anyway has become quite advanced and quite sophisticated. The structures there for participation. A two-way toolbox talk would meet the requirements depending on proportionality size of the organisation. So if you want a one-word answer, yes, that's possible for the question as set.
Okay.
And Dara, what do you need? You could say a photograph. Take a pic of you delivering your toolbox talk in the mess room to 3 or 4 people. Perhaps put today's, photographs, you know what it's like, Dara. They have a date recording. You have software that will load up that photograph. There you are. There's your documented information of worker involvement.
Well, look, Effective Software have a wonderful app called Engage that does an awful lot of that as well, which I have to get a plug in for while I'm here. But no, look, absolutely, and I think there's a lot of opportunity there for basic technology, some free stuff that's out there to capture that, as well as companies like ourselves who are kind of pushing obviously some other tools to help organisations across the block and achieve that. One of the other questions: would an employee feedback register be a realistic opportunity to meet employee involvement? So tracking that feedback and sort of showing them maybe how you've integrated that within the standard. Yeah,
ideal. And we can either take the tick box approach. When people clock in, sign this toolbox talk feedback register, and then get on with the job, and nothing happens. That's the tick box, isn't it, Dara? But it is a true opportunity. So Steve asked that question. Yeah, it is a true opportunity, and you're talking about risks and opportunities. That's a really good one, because you've already got documented information to capture that. But what does it mean? And this is where we're looking back to the sincere and honest approach to other safety, isn't it?
Exactly. And the onus is on the companies to do that and do that well, I guess. So just in terms of, we might take one more question because I know we're kind of pushing up on time here, and what we will do, anything that we've not got to, we'll collate. But just in terms of, I suppose it's again, it's been a common question coming through in relation to that change from management responsibility to leadership. Now I know you touched off this already, but just if you can maybe give your kind of further thoughts in where you think that kind of that change came from. So the key gap, I guess, from moving from what that management responsibility to leadership means.
Yes, I think, and as the questioner said, it comes from the high-level structure. I think a lot of it is that management responsibility was perhaps a bit of an ephemeral. It's perhaps a non-specific sort of term that made it difficult to measure it, whereas with leadership, and this touching on this dispersed leadership that I've been talking about, it's a much more modern way of dealing with health and safety. However, the standards concentrates and defines the leadership and the specific actions they've got to take. And I think the attempt is to try and identify those at the top of the management chain rather than just management responsibility, and try and individualize it. However, it is a high-level structure issue, and whilst that's how I'd explain it in health and safety, the environment and the quality approach to that may be interpreted in a different way. I wouldn't like to say too much about how others are going to interpret that in those other standards.
Of course, of course. Okay, Chris. Look, I mean, there are still questions coming through, but I think we've probably kind of reached our limit in terms of the time that we had available. So, as we did mention, look, at the start of the webcast, we'll bucket up some of those key topics, and Chris has kindly agreed to go through those and give us some feedback. So we will absolutely go and publish those questions and responses back through Chris's LinkedIn forum, the ISO EHS 45001 forum. And we'll also distribute a summary of those questions and responses back out to all attendees via email as well. So if you do have any other questions that haven't been addressed, do send them through right now to Kevin, and we'll collate those in. And look, I suppose before we finish up, I have to give a quick plug to Effective. So look, in our mission to transform workplace safety, we are helping a lot of organizations reach and maintain certification, the standards across the globe. So anyone on there, please feel free to request a demo on our website to understand what we do and how we can help your organization. Thanks to Chris for his valuable input. It's been very enjoyable, Chris. I think it's been hugely educational for myself and hopefully for the listeners. So really thank you for your time and input, and thank you everybody online for listening. I think that's it. Thank you, Chris. I'll say goodbye.
Thank you.